Manenberg. There we go. So I just want to talk a bit about your experiences dealing with gangs while you were at the safety lab. If you could just tell a bit about like what was the type of gang work that you did, and what was it like working in the gang areas, and how do the gangs operate? So it's like those three things, like what you would like, who were the gangs? So that whole context of like what's the gang scenario in Cape Town back when you were at the safety lab, what you did with the safety lab, and what's the general context?
Okay. Yes. So when I came to the lab, I think we focus on the intervention and the mediation. So I worked close with Nate at that time on intervention and mediation. So the target area for us was Manenberg, all right, and then we had to start build relationships with community activists that claim that they do gang work in the area, and we also have to build a relationship with the gang leaders to get to the shot callers and get to the shooters, which I think was the high risk individuals, all right? And so I have to, it's like start afresh, coming from a Noah Park, from the ceasefire project, we had the relationships with gang leaders, with their shot callers, and with their shooters. But Manenberg was like new for gang intervention. And also, they already had the idea we part of a ceasefire.
So just to take us back, this is when you were with Pastor Craven in Hanover Park and Manenberg. Is that right? And who
Yes,
were the
yes.
two big gangs there at the time? Were the Americans and Hard
At the
Livings?
time, the major gangs were the Hard Livings, Americans, Clever Kids, Dixie Boys, and then the Jester Kids. But the Jester Kids wasn't a major gang, but historically, they were one of the big gangs that still survived. But that was the major gangs. And at that time, because we had a relationship with the American gang coming from a Noah Park. So in a Noah Park, you don't get hard livings and clever kids. I mean, you don't get hard livings, clever kids, and Dixie Boys in a Noah Park, but you get Americans. So it was easy for us with the relationship we had with the Americans in a Noah Park to reconnect with the Americans in Manenberg. And because myself, I was one of the pioneers of the American gang, one of the people that start recruiting and expanding the gang. So the
So
leadership,
just as a bit of context, this is back when you were in the gangs before you did your time, and
yes,
yeah, you came clean and joined
yeah,
the safety lab. Yeah.
yes, Douglas, that was before safety lab, before ceasefire, right? I was a gang member, a key role player in the gang as well. So the time when I started with ceasefire and working for the safety lab, most of the gang leaders were old friends of mine, right? It's old gangsters, but they have leadership position in the gang. So in Manenberg, because the Americans' enemies is the hard livings, so I have to go now with Nate to the hard livings. And I was a bit anxious because I didn't know how they would take it.
So this is again is
In the
back
Noah
in the
Park, we
present
did the
when you
work.
are negotiating. You're no longer you're no longer a gang member. You're now in the safety lab, and you're now working with Nate to reduce gang violence, right?
Yes, right. And to look at gang intervention, what type of gang intervention will work to reduce the murder rate, to reduce the violence, and yes, so I have to reconnect and I have to go to the hard livings was the biggest challenge for me. And at that time, Manenberg was high risk. You couldn't in the evenings you couldn't easily get access into Manenberg because of the police roadblocks and stuff. Many times we were pulled over. We got calls to respond to gang shootings. The first shooting response, I think it was with night, and it was about 5 people that got shot and killed on one street corner. I'm not sure what gang they belong to, but it was a gang shooting. So yeah, and then we got connected, like I said, to the community activists, like the late Errol, who were the go in between gangs. All right, so and then we start connecting with him and try to support him with the gang intervention work. And I started working closely with him, right? And that's how we got involved in the gang mediation. So whenever there was gang conflict, myself and Nate and Errol will go in and go and talk with both gangs who's involved in the conflict. And then we would, if we got the buy-in of them, we got all the information, we plan strategize as quickly as possible, get a safe venue, bring them together. And most of our mediations happened on the streets, right? Because both gangs didn't want to go out of Manenberg. So at ceasefire, the strategy where they will take the gangs out of the hotspot area to a neutral place where it is safe for everyone. But Manenberg were a different dynamics. Manenberg gangs wanted to the conflict to be mediated in Manenberg in front of the community. So you will stand on an open field, right? With the shot callers coming into the middle of the field is very rarely where you will get the gang leaders in the conflict mediation. You will get them in the engagement when you have to go into the hotspot, right? And then you talk with the gang leader, and when he agree that they're willing to go to the mediation, he will delegate 2 shot callers to go, right? And then you will stand on the middle of the field with gangs on the one side and the community on the one side and gangs on the other side with their community. And then we will be in the middle and hear both sides um, issues that causes the conflict or the gang shootings, and then we will mediate, and when they're happy, and then they will agree on um, to resolve the conflict. At times there will be rules set, although they resolve the conflict, but they don't want gangs. The clever kids don't want hard livings to come into the area, and vice versa. And then we have to monitor and be on call when gang leaders or shot callers will call us and say there's people that don't respect or abide by the rules. So that was, um, can I say, the content of that gang intervention at that period of time. And at times you must be willing to take the blame if the truths are broken between them. But you have to try your best just to stay neutral So if you today, if you speak now with the hard livings, you must make sure that you will, from the hard livings, proceed, for example, to the Americans and speak with them as well, because the perception can be you more favorable towards the hard livings or you're more favorable towards the American gang or the Clever Kid or the Dixie Boys. So that was the is it four? Because the Clever Kids and the Dixie Boys is like one gang, right? But that was the gangs that ruled the streets and are currently still ruling Manenberg, with a new gang also now coming into play was the Fancy Boys, but they were always only they started in the northern part of Manenberg, right? They can't get access to the southern part or the center of Manenberg where the hard livings and Americans and clever kids still rule.
Tell me a bit more about them. Now, how did they get started as a gang, and what was their presence? And what were they known for?
The I think the hard livings out with when they started, but it's about 30 years ago, all right? So they grew. They were from Manenberg, from Manenberg Avenue. They have. They call it the box. It is where the courts are, the Audrey Court and the Letter Court. So that was where the hard livings struggled were. In the 80s, the Americans also had a struggle inside the hard livings area, right? But when Rashid and Rashad got released from prison, they quickly started a gang war with the Americans and pushed them out of the area, right? More to the Sonder End area and is it Sonder End and Shelter Road area, which is now the American Stronghold and Storms River. So the American gang also give birth around 1980 or expand 1984, 1984, 85, 6, 7 in the Manenberg area, but they were in many other areas in the Cape Flats, Noah Park, Bontiville, Elsis River, in most areas in the Cape Flats. The Americans expand and grow as one of the major gangs, and can I say the strongest gangs at that time in the Cape Flats. And so they were challenged by the hard livings, and there was a kind of alliance between the Americans and the Clever Kids in Manenberg and the Dixie Boy gang in Manenberg. And that alliance was formed against the hard living gang, because the hard living gang was one of the major and also the biggest and strongest gangs in Manenberg that was very well managed by the famous Rashid Staghe and Rasad Staghe. And even the guys that they shot callers that have now become the leaders, you can see they have very good leadership skills of how to manage the gang and how to organize the gang.
And what did that look like? How did they manage and organize the gang?
I think the rules that they implemented was rules that they learned and taken from the prison number gangs to form a structure in the street gangs, right? So there was lots of techniques out of the number gang that they implemented into the hard living gang. and the respect that they had for the prison number gang members that got released. I got very senior positions in the street gang of the hard livings. Where in the American gang it was the opposite. They had prison gang members, but they didn't have much respect for that kind of leadership structure. And that have caused the conflict, the internal conflict in the American gang. Because in the American gang, most leaders, they weren't really prison gang members. Some of them never served sentences. Right? They're just very streetwise. They know how to survive on the streets and how to manage gang members. You can come from prison, you can never be in prison, but they have that, but they didn't have much respect for that type of policies. And I think that is where the cracks were falling in the American gang. They were more mobilizing against some of the members that were released from prison, where the hard livings accepted their members that got released from prison and give them positions in the gang, give them drug houses to control, give them territory to control, etc. Where the American gang don't mean you come from prison, you can get, a place at the round table.
So
Even if you got your
oh, I was
say
going to
again.
ask her. It sounds like basically the hard livings had a good system of assimilating people coming outside from prison back into the gangs, and they had a good way of incorporating them back into the gang on the street. Whereas the
Yes.
Americans didn't have that system of dealing with people coming from the prisons to rejoin the gang again, and that caused friction.
Yes, sir. Exactly. And that's why the hard living gangs are smart. Them even I don't have much insight in the clever kids gang, but through the work that I have done with the lab, I could see even their members when they got released, they immediately got senior leadership positions in the gang. It's like their seats were reserved for the 20 something years those guys were in prison, right? And when they came back, they immediately got the leadership positions, and they also implemented the prison gang, some of the prison gang techniques they implemented in the street gangs, and they became one of and is one of the most powerful gangs in Manenberg. They're not a big gang. They weren't a big gang, but they expanded and they even taken from the hard livings territory. So now the Americans is more friendly now and in alliance with the hard livings to keep their old friends out of their territory now.
Oh
The
wow!
clever kids and the Dixies. Because the Americans have lost territory where the clever kids and the Dixie boys gained and they took from the hard livings territory. So the Americans and the hard livings is saying we were enemies, but we need to stand together against them because they're going to walk you over to get to us.
And
So
and
now they form that alliance.
and the hard livings and the Americans were the two traditional enemies. That was like their two. They were the two big
Yes,
rivals. Didn't the Dixie Boys,
yes.
weren't they used to be part of the Americans at one stage?
No, yeah, at one stage, right?
Early
The
years.
Americans, the Dixie Boys, and the Clever Kids, they were an alliance against the Hard Livings.
Okay.
Yeah, but when we got involved, we could have seen as the lab that that alliance is not going to stand,
And why
all
did that
right?
alliance break down between the Dixie Boys
Because
and
they
the
wanted to
Americans?
force the Americans to open for them to come through to the hard livings. But if the Americans opened the territory, then the hard livings shoot at the Americans, so they were caught in the middle because they are caught. Their territory is in the middle of is like the borderline for the clever kids, and it's the borderline for the hard livings. But because now the clever kids grow so strong that they don't need the Americans as an alliance. Because the Americans grew weaker, they didn't have that same status that they had before the clever kid leaders went to prison. Because remember, the Americans could provide guns to the clever kids. They could have provided drugs, but now the clever kids got their own connections. And they have more guns. And now they need to expand the territories, but the Americans are in the way now.
So the alliance just wasn't working out. Basically, the clever kids outgrew the Americans and now wanted
Yes,
to,
and then the and
take
then
the
the
territory.
old gangsters of the Americans were pushed out by the Americans that had a relationship with the clever kids leaders. So that's why that there's no need for that alliance because there's nobody that can manage that relationship. Because the shot callers have become now the leaders of the American gang and they're pushing their old gangsters out of the way and said there's no need. If you cannot connect us to ever have guns and drugs, there's no need for you to keep your seat as a leader of our gang. Because some of the leaders they're under the the they're under the surveillance of intelligence. So they get scared. Or either they have to give information. So some of us just take a step back. Right? So that they don't know nothing, but then they lose their power. Right? Or they have to hand over to shot callers, and then the shot caller became powerful and don't want to hand the power back to the leadership or submit under the leaders. So that was all the internal stuff happening, right? Where shot callers become leaders and old gangsters don't want to give off they want the power, but they don't have the relationship and the connections and the supplies to hold on to that power. And some of them just lose the respect. And because the shot caller guys was on the street and the gang leader, either because you have a lot of money, you have to move out of the area. So you have to rely on the shot caller for information because sometimes they don't want to come into the Cape Flats because they're under surveillance and under the, can I say, intimidation of intelligence or SAPs. Right? So it prevents them of operating on a street level. Because in street gangs, you're the street, if you're the gang boss, you need still to stand on that corner. Even if they can see your car, you need to be visible. Right? If you're not there for 2-3 weeks, you get disconnected to the daily life of the street gang life. Right? Because we say street gangs, but it means street gangs is you need to be on the street corner. Although you're a million, although you drive a fancy luxury car, if you're not on that corner, it's not your corner anymore. You don't have control there.
So is it like I'm busy trying to get an understanding what that disconnection looks like. Is it like they stop being aware of who's doing what and knowing who's challenging their territory? Is it that they're just losing connection with their foot soldiers, that their foot soldiers start doing their own thing and crazy, chaos starts happening? Is it that they other people see that they're not around, like other gangs, and then think that's a signal to start moving into their territory? Or is it all of these things combined? So a bit of this. I'm just trying to understand, like, how does that loss of connection with the ground, with the street, like what does it actually look like
Yes.
for someone?
Yeah. I think it's all of those things, and it's because now he needs to disconnect himself. The soldiers, he don't want the soldiers to know that he's still connected to the gang, he's still supplying. Because if the soldiers get arrested, they can say we get the guns from the or orders from the leader. So now we disconnect him. So the shot caller is in the middle. So the shot caller look more than the leader. So the shot caller will say, no, the leader is not giving the support anymore. Because that's what the leader want the soldiers to hear. But now the soldier believe what the shot caller say. And then he start disrespecting the leader. Alright? Because the leader don't want his name connected because of the new law that they brought in, the Poka law. Alright? So he tried to disconnect him, but now that means he's going to lose power. So now when you want to claim the power, the shot caller feel he is in charge. Because he have to answer when the bullets fly. He have to answer to the soldiers. And that's where the conflict now starts.
I see. So it's essentially the bosses got caught in between the tension of trying to shield themselves from the law, like the Papia Act, the law, South African laws, sort of that make it easier for the government to arrest people when they do organized crime. And the solution to that was to appoint a middleman, the shot callers.
Yes.
But then the gang boss loses connection with the ground, and B, the shot caller gains power because they're now connected to the ground, and so there's a tension.
And he's on the street.
Yeah, so there's a natural tension there between the gang boss, who used to be on the street all the time, but is no longer there to shield himself from the law, give himself deniability, and the shot caller, who's the middle management, who's there and so has the real power because he knows what's going on there. People see he's there. People, has the credibility and what you call, I suppose, if you're a state, like the writ, the ability to execute power on the ground. And the gang law doesn't really have that anymore. And they can't really navigate around. Like there's a tension here that they can't really manage very easily. In their effort to protect themselves from the law and keep their territory at the same time.
Yes, that's exactly what is happening. And so that's lots of dynamics is happening and changing. And if you, like I said, if you're not on the street, you're not part of the gang, all right? Even if you support them, they want to see you as a leader on the street. And now the leader don't want to be seen in the group. It's like you don't want witnesses on whatever he say. And then you get other gangs, they don't care. Like the clever kids, all right? They will stand on that street corner. They don't mind if the cops see them. All right? They don't care about the Pokawit. They won't go on that field where the mediation is, but he will stand amongst his soldiers as the leader.
And that gives them extra power, which allows them to get stronger.
Yes.
Because the management of the clever kids is prepared to take the risk and not shield themselves from the law. So they don't have the same dynamic, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Even the hard living, some of them took the risk. All right? Although they know they're going to be arrested tonight and being interrogated, but because they want to keep on that power, they know they have to be on the streets. Where the Americans gang leader said, no, all right, we're not going there. We leave everything in the shot caller's hand. And now when he feel that he's losing power, he think he can just walk in the door again. Then he realize, no, the shot callers have strategized or feel they are more powerful than him, all right? And they want control of the whole gang. Like with especially with the Manenberg gang leader, the shot callers even went to an up-close neighborhood where he stayed and they got arrested on their way. Don't know how intelligence got the information, right? And they were prepared to take this leader out, their own leader out, a guy that have mentored them. And that's why that gang is something almost of the past in history. Because there are these smaller gangs that have even taken over the territory. We got the splinter group gangs now. They're smaller, but they have more power than the big gangs.
Because they're more closer. Because they're closer to the ground. They're close to the street level. Is that why?
They close, yes.
Reality on the
And
ground.
there's one particular gang who is now becoming one of the major gangs in the Cape Flats. Most of their leaders were already arrested under the Pokabet and got sentenced and completed that sentence. And now they know how to beat that. Right? And they are more organized now than the other big gangs. The Hard Livings, the Americans, right? And I don't know if we're going to broadcast, but the Fancy Boy gang is now, just taking over from any major gang. Right? And they will challenge you, one of the historical gangs, because that makes their name more powerful, because now the people will speak about the Fancy Boys and the Hard Livings is in a gang war, and they're pushing the Hard Livings back, or the Americans and the Fancy Boys. So the Fancy Boys grew more powerful by challenging those historical big gangs, and they're pushing them out. And the more they push them out, the more splinter groups come up. Like you get now IGBs, right? They come out of the American territories, and some of the members are Americans, but they don't want to be attached to that name, right? Also for reasons of trying to avoid SAPs, but now they also challenge the gangs, the historical gangs, and say, if you're not falling under this new policy here, you're out, right? And if you want to dispute us, we're willing to kill you, no matter your reputation. And we in the labs time also, we could have seen, as I have done the interventions, you could see more families get involved, and I say females, when I say families, got involved in the gangs business. Because now gangs becomes a business where you can earn big money for you and your family to survive. So families are part of the gang, although and you don't need tattoos to be part of the gang now. It's about the business now. It's about pushing product, right? Who is connected and who has the most products. And most of the junior gang members or the younger generation, they are connected with other nationals and especially African national guys that knows how to get the drugs on the streets. Right? So now they use the younger gang members, the shop callers, and say, okay, we have a product. Can you sell our product for much cheaper as your gang leader is giving it to you? So now the shop caller is working two products, which create conflict in the gang. Right? Because you think, okay, this product is not from maybe the 28s. So my gang leader, there's no way the gang can, have issues with this. But now his leader will have issues. Because that helps, that makes the shop caller stronger. The shop caller can have his own connection now, or connect, which is this African and international guys, right? That especially deal with the Unga.
Just to clarify, are these two separate products? I assume that they're both, they're all drugs, illicit drugs, but are they like two separate products, like two different types of drugs? Or are they the same drugs but from two different sources? I mean, either way, they're from different sources. And I can definitely see the tension there that the shot caller is essentially selling two products from two different suppliers. One supplier is his boss, and then another
Yes,
supplier is an independent who he's not telling his boss about. So I can see
yes,
that, if, especially if it's like the same product, then essentially the boss could see it as stealing money from him because he's stealing clients away. Same salesperson stealing clients away
yes,
but not selling his product. Is it something like that? I just
yes,
want to clarify.
yeah. It started with two products, right? The gang leader is selling thick meth.
Crystal meth, yeah.
Yeah. Now the African connection, national connection is unga, which is a cheaper drug. So most
And
people
what
will go
exactly
for the cheap.
is unga? Just to quickly explain.
Unga is like the offcut, the offcut of heroin, of pure heroin. It's not pure heroin, but it's the offcuts from heroin
So it's like
that they
the
mix with other.
cheap stuff from heroin that less people want, and that's kind of mixed in with other things, just cut.
Yes.
Okay.
So it started with two products, with two different products. But now also they will tell the shot caller we can get tip also for more cheaper for you. Right? And now because the gang leader is not on the street, he don't get that information in real time. But when the money, say he's used to getting a 10,000 rand, suddenly that 10,000 rand is cut. Now the shot caller will tell him, listen, it's unga. Somebody selling unga here, but it's somebody that he have appointed. And he gives that independent person protection as well against the gang, right? For trying to tax this person because that money is coming to him. And that's where the internal conflicts will start. But the clever kids won't allow that, right? Or the hard livings, they say, no, we will sell unga as well. And as long as we get our money, as long as no money goes out here to anyone else. But in some areas, right, some gang leaders can't manage that part, right? And at the end, it's a problem for them. And then they're not relevant anymore.
And then they've lost connection with the street and they lose their power. And then new people come up,
Yes,
right?
sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. But now some of them have pulled their families in, right? That still stays in the Cape Flats. And now some gang members think, no, but your family did nothing. They didn't fight any gang wars and you just give them power because of your name. All right? And some families feel, no, it's our fathers and uncles that have started this gang and have went to prison for this gang and we are entitled. Right? So families get that entitlement and then the soldiers say, no, don't work like that.
You didn't earn
You
it.
need to kill someone.
Yeah.
You need to go to prison, right? And that creates all of this gang shootings and we you will get females get shot and it will say mistaken identity. Sometimes it's real and sometimes it's just the target, right? Because the female is selling the drugs or is supplying the drugs or is just a connection, right?
And that's a result of
And
instability within the gang itself. You got a tension between the foot soldiers who are doing the job and I suppose, the legacy people, the people whose family members founded the gang and now expect something from it, and they're trying to get something, and then there's a clash there. So that's an internal tension within
yes,
the gang.
yes, yes. Yeah, so I have learned quite a lot of reasons why this conflict is happening, and even properties involved, right? It was all the years it was a gang house, but now the gang leader passed away. Now the family want to take the house, but the gang say no, this is our house. Yes, you can have papers, but all the years we have sell drugs from this house. This is a gang house. This house belong in the gang. So you can't take it as your inheritance. And that's where all hell broke loose, where people just feel, no, this is my father's house. I don't care about his gang thing. Give a house, get out, and it's shooting all over. Especially in the Noah Park is a good example of what I'm talking now about, right? Because things have evolved in the gang world now for all of these years, and since we last did um, direct gang interventions or were involved directly in conflict mediation.
So this period you're talking about, this was what about gosh, about 10 years? Maybe not quite that long. Maybe 5 to 10 years ago. Is that sort of the period?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
So
Between,
somewhere between like 2016 and 2020, 21. Is that right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. And it's just exploding now.
And now
Because
it's
we,
okay.
yeah, we have all of this information. We could have seen how this is going to develop, right? Because most of this shot callers, the gang leaders, and the shooters is people that we have engaged with. And even some of the shooters that have survived, the highest individuals, the youth between that time, between 16 and 25 years old, they have become now either shot callers or they are the leaders now, right? And they feel they were being used by the OGs, right? So if the OG family is not going to submit under them, they're going to kill them, right? There's no moral, put it that way, all right? Because if you look psychologically into this thing, you can see why it's happening like this. Like I said, if you look in the time that we have worked, those were youngsters even between 14 and 25. So now it's 5 years along the line. They have went to prison. Some have come out now. They are more matured in this gang world now, right? They have even passed the shot caller position. They are now fighting and so we the leaders of today. Your time is done. We have our own connect, right? Your product is too high for us. We can get it for half the price. And guns. You can't supply us with that because you are under intelligence, you have withdraw, whatever the reason is, right? You have lost your money, now you want to come back because of your reputation. Thus, they said, no, we also now have suffered. We also have sacrificed. We also have lost friends while you were sitting in Plattekloof or in Constantia. Right? You weren't present here. So we wearing the crown now. And you have to take it with blood.
So the gang bosses almost need foot soldiers on the ground to keep the shot callers, the middle managers in check, to keep their power.
Yes,
That's sort
sir.
of a typical way that they do things so that they can keep their fancy house in the fancy areas far away from the street and
Yeah.
maintain that money coming, that power on the street.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you repeat yourself, Douglas?
Oh, sorry, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I
was just
missed
saying. So
something.
it sounds like the gang bosses need like soldiers who are loyal only to them to keep the middle managers, the shot callers on the street, in check, so they don't go rogue and work for themselves. Like, is that a common tactic for keeping power on the street?
I'm not sure, but that would have been a good, if they, that would be a good idea. I'm not sure, right? Because most of them, yeah, I think that in the hard living gang, it was evident.
That they did this?
That is what the hard livings did,
Yeah.
right? They had soldiers that is loyal to them, but they are on the streets, right? And interesting, I don't know how they connect, keep it live, but there was times if we wanted to speak with the leaders, there were a certain house we will find all of them. with the soldiers, right, that have that is dealing directly with them. They will have this big meeting, come together, right, in this at this gang house in the area, and then they will disappear for a couple of days. But they will make sure that they call that soldiers, right, that works the street for them to that house. So I think that's basically how they still keep on to power.
So it's almost like the hard livings have got a smaller, tighter model, so it's hard for them to expand, but they stick together better than say the Americans. The Americans have got all these problems of keeping things together because they don't have the same managerial structures to prevent
Yes.
these internal contradictions.
Yeah, and it's a big organization. The Americans were a very big organization.
How big were they at their peak?
I think 5,000 and more.
5,000 members. Is a
Yeah,
good estimate. Yeah.
and yeah, I think it could be 5,000 plus.
Yeah, and this was about 10 years ago, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and now the numbers are decreasing now of the membership. You can see at the funerals. Usually they had these big funerals where hundreds of members will come from all over, right? But you can see when the members got shot and killed, you will only find like 30, 40. That is a lot. Even you will find less members, even if it is a higher ranking gang leader, right, that get shot and killed. So they are decreasing rapidly in numbers. Even the hard livings, you can see they can't really expand. Although in Manenberg they're still tight, but they can't expand into other areas because the leaders in other areas is not so strong as the Manenberg leaders, right? Because they had two good mentors, Rashid and Rasad, that have ruled that gang with the iron fist, but with much respect, right? Very much respect.
And just to recap, what happened to them? I know that one of them was assassinated in the early 90s, or mid 90s.
My Pagat, yeah,
Pagad, yeah.
Rashid was shot and killed in London Road at the same house where Rasad out by the Vigilante group. Um, so Rashid's son, Dullah, he also went into conflict with the hard living leadership. What was it, Watson at that time in Nani? So Watson took over from Rashid, right? And then Dullah grew up and thought because his father was the leader, he should get the position. And he was very rebellious against the new leadership. And then he got membership of the Fancy Boy gang, and they entertained him for the sake of his father. But I think it was evident in our work at the lab that we could see that he's going to get killed, right? There was time when they would invite him also to mediations, which he was not the right candidate. But I think it was to try and keep Rashid happy at the time, right? And see can they save Dullah because out of respect. So Dullah connected to many gangs that the hard livings weren't happy. And I think it created conflict with his father. And then at the end, he got shot in London Road. But now it's evident there was lots of rumors. But the 28 gang, Ralph Stanfield, are being charged with that murder of Rashid Staghe. Yeah, he was recently, a couple of months ago, they charged Ralph with the murder of Rashid.
Yeah.
So that's how Rashid got killed. And We don't know if because Rashid was in the church and Rashid was in the gang, so
You
right.
don't actually know if he was still, you know,
We
which side
know,
he was
and we
playing.
also
Yeah, the legal
I say
side, was he being
we know,
legal
we
in the
know. I mean,
gangs?
if I say we know myself, you, Nate, we know because
Yeah,
we
yeah.
work the
She
street.
was doing naughty things. Yeah.
Yeah, we know we when we went to the church to meet him, myself and Nate, he didn't show up. I don't know if you can remember that church in Pero with Waldeck, and then he got arrested while we were waiting at the church. So he was never in the church. I mean, right? Because we went to the church to meet, and then he got arrested on the streets. So
Well,
the church was just the front,
well, Nate, welcome,
right?
Nate. You're just at time. Colin is just giving me a lot of very important context for the gang violence intervention work that the Safety Lab was involved in. And actually, my next question was what type of intervention work was the Safety Lab doing to resolve gang violence? So this is I suppose Lab 2.0, maybe 2016 to 2020, around about that period. And I suppose now that we got a good understanding of the context, like what was the Safety Lab doing to sort of prevent violence, reduce the murder?
Okay, so in 2.0, so we're taking a lot of different steps that we could take. Well, I suppose the era Colin's talking about, we were doing direct mediation, in particular in Manenberg, to try to deal with gang conflicts that had been rising and rising in that area at that time. And I think in advance of Rashid returning to the community, because he had that home arrest period where he was really kind of living and calling whatever shots he was still involved in from the church. And Waldeck also decided to involve himself periodically because of that, seeing, I suppose, intuiting to some degree that there might be some kind of benefit to being a gang mediator. In that community and in the city, and hoping, I think, that he might be able to get some kind of contracts or some sort of role and responsibility in being a gang conflict mediator. But aside from the sort of mediation stuff, we were trying to build up a number of different systems, as well as promote um, the continuation of ceasefire at that time within the city, and trying to build up additional networks of gang members and gang influencers that could support in larger processes of doing gang intervention. So we were collecting and training and supporting a bunch of different community-based mediators and agencies that would be willing to do this kind of intervention. And by this, I mean direct responses to gang violence, mediating those gang conflicts, trying to help different individuals across the city transition away from gangs where possible, and trying to build up a better intelligence process so that we could map and understand the city even more effectively around gangs, what the violence levels were going to be, and where we thought the crisis points were going to be for that. The city at the time was in a number of discussions around what they were going to do about it. It was one of the, do they call them game changers? They had game changers for a while. And these game changers were meant to kind of be these massive citywide projects, in theory, that would try to have an effect on 10 different issues. And so some of those issues were driven by different provincial departments. They were trying to, so I was in those conversations and ended up exiting those conversations, and I honestly can't remember any of those conversations or efforts coming to any fruition. I'm sure there were some projects, but we ended up not being involved with any of them. So long story short, it was a lot of intelligence, understanding, analysis, better understanding the broader city problem, and that's when we started the Black Township violence investigation. Was because of a gang murder that happened in Guguletu at the time. Early days before people were talking, before people were talking about black gangs at all, and before
Is there a distinction between Black Township violence and violence on the Cape Flats? Again, normal gang, or what we typically associate as normal gang violence on the Cape Flats.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the reason we titled it Black Township Violence was because essentially the kind of violence data anyone couldn't get is really a closed box. It's basically just an extremely high murder rate and not a lot of detailed information about what or why the murder was happening there. And at the time, SAPS was saying there is no such thing as black gangs, and so we knew otherwise, but that wasn't going to be a very successful argument if we couldn't demonstrate a little bit more about how we knew that or what the proportionality was. So we needed to find out what's the broad proportionality of murder and violent crime in the Black Township, because right now it's just this huge number that no one is analyzing. And so that was part of the reason we were investigating not that there were black gangs, because we knew that and we were doing gang intervention for a long time in black townships about that, but because we couldn't really say with any even general proportionality what the violence rates were of, let's say, gangs, interpersonal, economic crime, intimate partner violence. Like, what would the categories be, and what would the proportionality be of that crime? And so we were investigating that at the same time we were trying to build up the systems we were approaching in the colored spaces, right? So the work we had been doing up until that point was largely through me doing my own direct mediation and consultation with communities around how to build up NGO responses to gangs, and the ceasefire app and advising and training that we had been doing. And so then in 2.0, we started doing some of that ourselves. So Colin and I were working together to build up networks across a number of newer communities, newer to the Safety Lab, although also newer, I suppose, than Manenberg is. But we were still supporting where we could in Hanover Park, and then also working in Manenberg, Mitchell's Plain. We did a number of diagnostics in Lavender Hill and elsewise, and we're building up networks of gang mediators and interventionists. I had been working in Manenberg for what became the Manenberg Safety Forum, but before it was the Safety Forum, it was just an informal community group designed to try to build up resource and understanding around gangs and do that mediation. It was partly because an individual named Wahid had received a small grant to do some work on that. Wahid Sakul, and he asked me to come help him out, and that kind of initiated a larger process for me. And we built this network of people in Manenberg that would meet regularly to discuss conflicts in Manenberg. And that's how I met Rashid, I guess, to bring it back to Colin's point, and met Waldeck, who was housing Rashid during his house arrest. So when Rashid got released from prison, he wasn't allowed in Manenberg, and he was living out in Belleville with, I don't know if he's living there, but I know that his larger sort of process and engagement was through Waldeck's church, and Waldeck's claim to sort of NGO work through that church. And so I met him there, and we spoke a bit. His claim to us was, he's just not involving himself in any of this activity at the time. And so he wasn't really either helpful or hurtful when it came to the conflict in Manenberg in those days. But to Colin's point, we in 2.0 we would have these meetings, and there'd be random people showing up to the mediations, and at times Rashid's son would show up, which was kind of perplexing because he was never really a part of at least the Manenberg side of things until he chose to show up. And that would always be kind of a moment where both the community would kind of have an alarm and an alert because he would drive around in like a fancy BMW that everyone recognized. He had like a new, was it an M3? Something like an M3 coupe with tinted windows and some sort of like bright paint, and he would come in and but he never really spoke. He was just kind of there to be there, and even then, like, you know, there was some attempt at protecting him from the hard living side. They would say, no, he's not really, you know, a part of things, and then the other gangs would say, no, he's obviously here because Rashid is pulling all the strings and Rashid is the one running things from afar. And so then we would be working on those. I mean, broadly speaking, that was us doing direct mediation in the community, which was a lot of intelligence gathering, a lot of relationship building, a lot of constant sort of check-ins and feedback, and dealing with different gang members, in particular decision makers and shooters, and trying to collect a sense of when conflict might be able to be ripe enough to be reduced or stopped, and then go and perform mediation. So sometimes that was us doing almost all of the talking, and other times that was sort of just making sure we provided cover for the groups to get together to work and resolve issues verbally that they were having conflict over, which usually started with something crazy and ridiculous like cell phone theft, or crazy and ridiculous to us, I guess, for the amount of murder that might be happening, which was also just a lot of stolen or otherwise relationship problems. I'll call them that, you know. Intimate partners choosing to involve themselves with opposite gang members, and that causing a whole bunch of ego drama, which what isn't unto itself a gang problem, but when the gang member then retaliates, it becomes very immediately a gang problem. And that might sound crazy to us, but the organization is primed for response, right? So if you are a gang member and you shoot at or kill another gang member in cold blood because of a personal issue, the gangs have no option except to assume that that's a gang-related murder. And so they just automatically get into retaliation mode, and that retaliation mode escalates quickly and violently, and then before you know it, it doesn't matter what initiated it. The only thing that matters is that it is a conflict. And so a lot of the resolution would be sort of just getting everyone to come to the table and admit that they don't have a specific reason. They're not trying to seek new territory or have a direct reason to be engaged in that conflict, but instead be able to say out loud to each other that they are in it because the other one has aggressed them, and they don't have any aims or outcomes out of that conflict except to show force and to respond to aggression when it shows up. And so that was where a number of our conflicts originated, although they do sometimes originate out of territory disputes, but those boil, right? Those transitions don't happen tactically. They happen slowly and somewhat organically via people moving in and out or changing their allegiances from one gang to another. And so those are sometimes a little harder to resolve, but the former was mostly what we were dealing with in that era. So that's the direct gang work that we were up to at the time. And you know, there's a number of stories that will come out of this, I think, of just interesting dynamics that existed within that process because of that.
Fascinating.
But what else am I missing? What else did I just jump into here? I've only heard the last bit about Rashid and
So Colin gave me a complete account of how the gangs function in the Cape Flats, the different types of gangs, and the type of activities they do. But more interestingly, and I suppose more importantly for us, and how violence spirals in this case, the managerial structure of the gangs and how the gangs maintain order or fail to maintain order within themselves and between each other. And you just sort of talked about quite a few points on how they failed to maintain order between each other, so maintain peace between each other. And one of the breakdowns, as you mentioned, was individual foot soldiers, gang members having interpersonal relations with family members from other gangs that can spill over into gang conflicts. But we were also talking about within gangs, the managerial structure can create internal contradictions, internal pressures on gangs, which can kind of split them apart and be a source of weakness and a source of violence as well.
Yeah, yeah. So if we're talking about it like that, and Colin, please interrupt or jump in on any of what I'm saying. I think the issue in Cape Town that I don't think Cape Townians even realize entirely is there are too many gang members.
How many do you reckon? We already talked that the estimate for the Americans at their peak was around 5,000 gang members of varying levels of involvement in gang activities. But how many do you think there are these days? Just across the board, across all gangs.
5,000 Americans in the whole city? Sorry, Colin, you're muted, bud.
You're muted, Colin. We can't hear you.
Colin, you're muted. You're, muted, bud.
Sorry, I didn't mute. I think I mentioned at the peak, right? My involvement in the gang, we were like, on that high number across the Cape Flats. And then we were decreasing now rapidly, right? We're out of the American gang. You get the splinter groups, right?
Oh, okay.
And with the American gang started losing power. So that's not the number as we speak now. When we got involved as the lab, it was already decreasing since my exit out of the gang, right?
Yeah. No, I hear you, man. I think maybe if you're referring to it in that sort of like framework of like how many specifically just Americans at that era. But I think when we look at the sort of, we'll call it the franchising of the American gang, right? The larger network of people that associate themselves, not everyone that associates themselves with the flag, but all the different splinter gangs and everything else. I'd say I would say it's much larger than that for the Americans. When you think about what's on the ground and who says they've got an affiliation and who does something for the gang and uses it for cover and all of the very light entry points, but these are important to this discussion because what it means is that there's really no control or organization or leadership that manages the operations of the day-to-day gang in any sense of who's doing what. So and I'll put it to you this way: the belonging to a gang, the threshold to it is far smaller than we see represented in media or talk about. And so there may be only, I'm going to spitball. There may be only 5 or 6, obvious named gangs in Manenberg, for example. But then there's a number of not so obvious and sometimes lesser named gangs in the community. And then on top of that, many of the people that consider themselves members or at least affiliated to the gang are not really in discussions with leadership of that gang, right? They don't get invited to meetings, and they're not being given direct orders. They're more or less coming and going and asking for something to do. And along that pathway, a lot of them sort of pick up guns and knives and whatnot and become sort of more involved. So if we're talking sort of people that might be in the conversation and shooters, 5,000 could be about right. If we're talking about youth that are involved and that get into, conflict at school with other gang members and things of that nature, my guess is that number multiplies by 5 or 10-fold. And And so in the Cape Flats, and in particular the colored community, I'd say that in a lot of the neighborhoods, the 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 loose gang membership is closer to, sometimes half the men, half the young boys and men in the youth category,
And that's
because
some level of very loose membership of all gangs, all gang types in that area.
right.
Mm.
Right. So not speaking about the Americans only, and largely this is done, and it's tricky. It becomes very convoluted when you're trying to figure out sort of how to do, let's say, direct intervention that I was discussing. It becomes very easy if you're trying to do indirect intervention, such as educational programs or youth work or things along those lines, because you're almost certainly have somebody in your community grouping that is somehow affiliated to a gang. So within that, the reason that that's significant when it comes to the violence in South Africa is because it's very difficult to kind of define the gang, and how many people and who's leading it. The leadership spends most of its time thinking mostly about economic growth, a little bit about territory, but mostly because it's thinking about economic growth. So that is various businesses, sometimes legal, but mostly not legal. Distribution of black market goods, a lot of it being drugs, but some of it being other items, other things that are just regulated that they don't want to be regulated. And then, informal transit networks, random businesses of just kind of like facilitating community stuff. And then sometimes it's, toilet paper factories or fisheries.
Yeah.
So
Or
legal businesses, basically. Sorry, Colin.
abalone smuggling, crayfish, that was also a big thing. Out of that business, the 28s grew very powerful, going into the fishing industrial and, you know, making the connection between them and the Chinese, with the abalone, the crayfish, the perlamoon. That also had an impact
And that was an
in the increase
exchange.
of the gang violence on the Cape Flats.
And that was an exchange for the ingredients for crystal methamphetamine, right? With the
Yes, for me,
Chinese
and even
entities.
for ammunition. Yeah. Guys, can I quickly run to the toilet? I have an emergency. I drink too much
Of course.
cool drinks today.
Absolutely, but so because of that, there's just very little control over how these conflicts. Sounds like I had a lawnmower coming around. Uh, how these conflicts arise, and who's the instigator and who's responsible. Oftentimes the conflicts would be about, is this person a member? They say they're a member, and we say they're not a member, and that kind of issue goes on and persists. And so dealing with transitioning youth out of the gangs is, one, a little bit easier than in most places because there's so many, and so many of them are not truly, bought in. But it's much harder when it comes to trying to do the kind of, let's say, tactical and strategic analysis of what's happening in the community. How strong is a gang? It's hard to say. Some of the gangs that are now strong were just groups of these kids starting their own faction, and that's why there's so many factions within all these gangs. So you've got all these a new name of a new gang that might be loosely related to an American gang or the Fancy Boys or whatever it may be, starting up at all times because the youth sort of sometimes organize themselves to protect their own little neighborhood, but then they make a name for themselves because they're organized or they've pulled off something that upsets or otherwise agitates the larger gangs, and then they become their own franchise, I'll call it for now, their own franchise of a gang, and they get affiliated with whichever gang they're closest to, or the gang that a gang that represents a power oppositional to the one they hate the most, right? It's a love-hate kind of development process there. And so within that, that's how they kind of manage their growth, but also don't manage their organizational and operational behaviors. And so, yeah, so in that sense, it's kind of difficult to know, and it's hard to ascertain sort of how many members of a gang there are in the Cape Flats. It's very many by almost any international standard, um, and in that regard, it's very difficult to say like what, you know, depending on where you want to pitch your solution, what's going to cause the most safety. Um, I know government talks mostly about high flyers, quote unquote, or what other people might call shot callers and so on, in particular leaders. But broadly speaking, I don't see that any of these arrests of or detainment of leadership being the thing that drives down violence. It may drive down gang operations, you know, the various things that happen in the community, which, because for a while there's just kind of disarray around that higher level organization and operation, especially economically. But not so much on the streets, right? The streets almost never, unless they're talking about a strategic disadvantage, are talking about those big level decisions that get done or the deals that get made internationally between one gang boss and some company, facilitator, smuggler, country that's, you know, able to provide resources. The ground level of gangs in Cape Town is mostly just a whole lot of kids with almost nothing to do, and the only economic outlet they have for earning even small amounts of money is by doing stuff for and finding little tasks to
Back.
perform for the gang. Hey, bud.
Hi. Did I miss anything?
Nothing serious. I was just saying. I think like when it comes to the ground in South Africa, not a lot of the big international movements have much effect on what's going on. Mostly because the ground level, the street level of gang operation and membership is not directly tied all the time to the larger economic motives and interests of the gangs. So when you take out a leader like South Africa often wants to do, that doesn't necessarily change much about what's happening on the ground because they're largely doing it for the sake of organizing their own community and their own youth group and their own sense of safety. And so, even though South Africa has found a way to prosecute a number of the what they call high flyers, we don't see any downtick in gang violence because all that does is create disorganization on the larger strategic level of like how are we going to build more money, how are we going to open more businesses, how are we going to facilitate more money, and on the ground it's mostly 16 to 24-year olds who are not really intimately tied to the larger economic development of the gang. They're tied mostly to the community-based operations, street management, territory control of the gang, and so that's where we see most violence. I think is in that sort of person to person, sometimes individual to individual. They just happen to be members of gangs. Beef that comes up, and I made a point out of I didn't name the gangs, but some of those youth gangs we saw come up that started off as just like groups of high school kids that wanted to protect themselves or hated one or another large gang that then ended up becoming an actual gang eventually and kind of being able to make some decisions and have an influence in their network of gangs. And so that's kind of popping up all the time where kids are deciding, okay, I don't really belong to a gang now, and I don't want to wait around for them to even come and acknowledge us. We're going to start our own thing so that we can fight against, let's say, the Americans in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so difficult to define and sometimes so hard to navigate the conflict of the gangs in these spaces, is that it is kind of intrinsic to the neighborhood. And there's no way of talking to a leader that can tell you everything that's going on in the community around gangs because they don't know what's going on a lot of the time with the kids.
Yes, I think if I can come in our work, we were kind of source for most leaders when we have of information because they
Yeah.
didn't know what's going on the street. Remember, we built a structure in Manenberg, right? When we when you took me back to Manenberg, right, through the community engagement and try to get that connection to the leaders or to the high flyers, because everybody said you should speak to Watson. But Watson or Charlie Hankas, they weren't on the streets. We were more on the streets and directly engaging with the shot callers and with the high-risk individuals. All right, we already had the youth. They wanted to engage with us, the high-risk individuals, and there was no. At times, there weren't a need really to get the buy-in from the leadership, but out of, I don't want to say out of respect or acknowledge them, we have preferred to touch base with them, all right, and to more let them know as the lab, this is what we want to do with the library idea. And remember, no one did speak with gangs in Manenberg except the late Errol that have claimed, but were actually ignited through the work of the lab and the safety forum. And then he started making his trips north, south to the different gang leaders. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then we start bringing them together. Right? At first, they didn't want to go outside. They wanted us. And we did the mediations on the street. Right? And even when we withdraw until today, they know how to come together. Right? Because when in Manenberg already there was through the ceasefire program and the violence interruptions, gangs already knew how to find one another, right, to come together, although these were outside of Noah Park. But in Manenberg, we got it right to mediate that conflict in the middle of a shooting area, where you will get the community and the gang standing on one side with the leaders, and the gang and the leaders on that, and then all the shot callers or the spokespersons with us in the middle will come together, and even the police, the law enforcement. And even people said gangs don't want to work with police, but they asked us to organize this kind of presence in Manenberg. And that is some legacy that we have left behind. I feel, you know, that is from our work. We got them even to the library, where they sent selected leaders that, not leaders or people with key role in the gang. They didn't randomly just send anyone. We got it right that we could have asked for the relevant people, right, to be sent that can make decisions. At one time, the two of us were left alone by Errol that feels us he needs to get out of the space now. Right? And we were standing there and we mediate the conflict. So, yeah, and if I look back, even when I see them, I get that acknowledgement from them, because they know in their minds no one wanted to speak with them. Right? And we were the first two that went directly and say, we're willing to be that people that stands in the middle and bring you guys together. And now they know they shooting continue, but they know they can resolve the conflict. And I think what we got right is we wanted to reduce the violence. So on retaliation, we reduced that rate. Right? We couldn't control the shooting, but we could have control through our interventions and mediations, the retaliation. We could keep retaliation on hold. And sometimes we got that respect from them when we say we're going now down to the clever kids. There's no shooting in that period of time, although they will shoot after we came back with with the no answer or answer. So I think you have just confirmed, even when what I have shared with Douglas, the content of how we have worked in the intervention and the direct mediations that we done, and even the community engagement. Because when we came on board on the ceasefire project, we didn't know and feel how to connect with to involve community. Right, the lab actually break that ice between violence interrupters and community activists because there was a wall between us. Right, we thought it was only important to deal with a gang, but with the lab work, it breaks the wall and say the community is important role players. You need to have them right involved in this interventions or mediations.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess as you were talking, Colin, so I was having a conversation with some other, gang intervention agencies this week, and I was just sorry. I'm not sure. Can you guys hear that?
No, it's fine. We can see a little guy in a red jacket mowing around, but it's fine. We can't really hear them.
I didn't.
Yeah,
I'm blind. I can't see.
It's chosen a strange time to. It's actually raining. So anyway,
Oh,
the
okay.
here and it's raining, and I've got a lawnmower going on in the background here. But
Okay.
so I was talking to them, and I was telling them some of the work that we'd done, and some of the stuff we built, the projects we'd executed, and I was trying, I suppose, in some ways, to explain the difficulty in dealing with developing these things politically, both in the community and in the government. And they said, well, you wouldn't see anything like that here because, and I'm in Denver, not Denver, but I'm in the Denver metro. And I was perplexed by that because I didn't realize how much we tend to make everything sound like it happened quickly, organically, and solvably. like all of these things we did took a long time, right? And and involved, involved engaging with random spoilers and whole periods of time in which these things got kind of derailed. And I was thinking, as you were talking about Roshanda, who's kind of tried to take over the work that
Yeah.
we had built and started there with Errol and Wahid, even to some degree, and 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 how that's kind of spoiled some of that for the future is that Roshanda couldn't figure out what she was going to do. Was she advocating for dealing with youth in gangs? Was she trying to fight the gangs herself? Was she doing state's witness work for the government? And in some cases, I don't want to say whether or not she witnessed any of those crimes.
Yeah.
Just leave it at that. So the that can, all of those things, are setbacks that happen along the way as you're building those things. So you're right, Colin. I mean, I do think it had a lasting impression on people, and I think
Yeah.
the work as it was happening was exciting at times, and I don't mean exciting like thrilling in a fun way, but certainly thrilling in a challenging way.
Mm-mm.
And but there was always these long periods of time in which we had to sort of fight through various elements in order to make sure that it could continue. Different gatekeepers of the community, different politicians wanting not to see that happen, different gangs who just couldn't get along, or didn't like who was in the room, so they wouldn't show up, and all of that was quite a process of just sort of trying to stick to it. And I think honestly, like after a while, the social contract you build with a gang by showing up as much as we did was really the biggest motivator that we could the biggest motivating tool we had to make sure that gangs would continue showing up and participate. Because if they didn't, they knew that we were going to come around and be annoying.
Yeah.
We were going to come around and preach at them a little bit and say like, hey, you're the weak link here, and they never wanted to be seen as the weak link. And a lot of that, it comes back to that conflict.
They didn't want to be seen as the party not trying to reduce violence. In other words, they didn't want to be seen as an instigator.
Right. I mean, their story was that it was someone else's fault, right?
Yes.
Their story was this got started by the other group. And so if you're not willing to talk, then the news story in the community becomes they're not willing to show up to the table, right?
Yes.
And so that was kind of, and that's important. And to your point just now, Colin, that's an important way in which you include these community leaders. You don't.
Yeah.
There are a number of community leaders that care about it and that want to be loosely involved, but don't want to be in the gang meetings. So you also have to include them, because then you can use them as mouthpieces about the conflict. So you can
Yeah.
place pressure. You see, I'm gonna relate it to what's going on now in the Ukraine Russia conflict. So
Mm.
Trump says he's going to go solve this, right? And Putin managed to kind of pull the wool over Trump's eyes, and I won't get into the long history of that. But from a what is the public narrative standpoint, he was pretending like he wanted to come to the table for peace, that he'll have peace whenever Ukraine seriously wants peace. And then Ukraine comes to the table and says, no, obviously we're the ones that are being aggressed here. We want peace, and we'll show up to any peace talks.
Yeah.
And so then Ukraine keeps showing up and Russia doesn't, and now the narrative is even with Trump trying to protect Russia from this conversation. It becomes clearer and clearer that Russia, because they refuse to engage in this, because they offer no solutions, because they're continuing different types of things, Ukraine has sort of given itself the clearance to make these kinds of like what it did this last week with the drone strikes. It gives itself the international support for that by these micro movements within the negotiation of the conflict, and that's true in gangs as well. So when the community perceives it, that one gang is the aggressor, as much as we see them from the outside as being, they don't care about the community, they care about what the community thinks.
Yes.
But why do they care about what? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead, Douglas.
Why they care is because the community is their eyes and ears. Yeah, because if the community can, if the community is against them, it interrupts the business in the community.
Yeah.
All right. So they have to. It's a give and take. So they also have to consider the community's feelings, and I think we work on that part, like where we would suggest or recommend community leaders should also go and give them a visit. I don't know how it happened, but then they will send the message to us through the community. Was it through the community leaders that they're ready?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or they will send us to the community to say, we the guys that want to make peace. All right? Automatically, we got that buy-in because they didn't want it to be seen as the group. Although they have caused the problem, they have created it, but they don't want to see as the group that don't want to resolve it. And through that community engagements, it make the work more easier to get a buy-in, because to get a buy-in to come to that mediation is the most difficult part.
Yeah. I mean, it was getting everyone to the table, right? And so
Yeah.
more pressure. And you want to place pressure from any angle you can. I mean, some of the gangs do fatigue, and they just want to go to a peace process, right? They want business to continue, and they're not interested in this. And then there's different types of community and social leverage you can pull on them. They don't want to be hearing from their various friends in the community. I mean, they're all community members, and so if they're getting cold shouldered, and they're being told that they're the problem, they understand that as and it's antithetical to their own definition of their agency, right? Every gang has organized themselves under this sort of flag in the name of somehow doing some version of community development. Whether that's protecting their community from the other gangs, whether that's providing, and then a lot of them run soccer clubs and do these other things that they can't do in gang conflict.
Yeah.
And those are the things they're proud of. Funny enough, right? The leaders are proud of their soccer leagues and the things that they operate. I remember Colin mentioned that time that I got called in by one of the American leaders to I didn't know what for, to his house. And I get there, and I won't name him until you want to name him, Colin. But we get there, and he's just asked me to come over for essentially a barbecue, a braai. that he's cooking
Yes.
a big pot and wants me to hang out. I'd never met him before, and then we sit in his living room, and the living room is, you know, a normal sized living room, a normal middle class sized living room, and from ceiling to floor, wall to wall, it's soccer trophies of the club that he runs. And it's like, okay, this is. You mentioned the pigeon race, or the pigeon running that he had on the rooftop, but the first impression I
Yeah.
had was like, this guy runs all these youth soccer clubs that he's very, you know, proud of and into, and so he spoke about that for a while. But that's where, even, you know, the hard livings, they run the greens and they try to keep the soccer going there, and that's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that causes other
Mm-hmm.
problems for the youth, right? You can't really you can't hang out on this or that soccer field unless you're affiliated. But it works in the favor of trying to cause some kind of stasis, of trying to reduce conflict, because they want to do those things. They also want to be perceived as doing those things,
Yeah.
even if the violence far outweighs the good they do in the community at this stage. They see themselves through that positive lens. And so when people
Yeah.
start reminding them that they're not pulling their weight in the peace process, it hits their ego a little bit, and
Yeah.
it pulls them to the conversation of like, how do we end this conflict? So the leadership is very rarely involved in initiating conflict, but very often involved in shortening the timeline in which it operates.
Mm. Agreed.
So, anyways, yeah. So this is, I mean, I guess it's a very complicated. Yeah, I don't know how we want to tackle like the broader how do we explain gangs in Cape Town. But you know, that's the that's some of the experiences we had dealing with it in Manenberg.
Mm.
But Douglas, I'm interested. You know, I know you're very familiar because you've sat with us for years in this, and you've worked even to
Yeah.
some degree directly with gangs. But is there something that you think we're we're speaking too generally about or glossing over?
No, think I think we I think we're tackling everything that needs to be covered. That I can, yeah, off the top of my head, that's pertinent to this particular conversation, which is how do gangs operate? What is the context in in Cape Town,
Mm-hmm.
and what we did to try and mitigate it. But I am uh, curious, how did we start the conversation with the gangs? I mean, did we just rock up and start talking to people on the street? Did we just, yeah, I just want to know how do folks start the ball rolling and this sort of stuff in a high violence environment where people are often just too terrified to even go out in the street and, you know, talk to people?
You know, I mean, Colin's story is going to be different, right? And I don't know if we've had
Mm-hmm.
enough time to really, you know, explain how Colin's life trajectory that brought him to this. But
Mm-hmm.
broadly speaking, I think it's difficult. I think why if you're wise, you start with trying to speak to community agencies first. And I'm speaking about you know, anybody who would want to do this. Without knowing what their background is, I'd say you start with community agencies to understand the nature of the community. What I did, which was different, and I did it differently because of my previous history working in gang communities, was, and research into gangs and understanding gangs and so on, was I actually just hit the ground first. Hanover Park was an exception. I actually met with a number of the community agencies there first, because I had some connection to those community agencies and found some that I liked and trusted even before I met Colin. So I got pretty close with Case at that time and was spending
Mm-hmm.
time there via them. Had a few other community connections there, and then once I met Colin and Ceasefire, then I was more on the ground. But in Manenberg, we were the idea that they had was to build a community forum of NGOs, but the NGOs didn't have any real direct access to gangs. Errol, and who kind of had a loosely defined NGO, was invited, and he had a difficult to understand sort of relationship with some gangs, maybe only one at the time. So I started walking those streets in the same way that I walked the streets in Guguletu originally, just I guess to some degree on my own. Sometimes I would be with, in the Google Etu example, a church deacon from one of the main churches in the neighborhood. In Manenberg, started sort of just going and meeting with gang members and walking those streets with Errol, and sometimes on my own, just to meet and find out what people were doing and what was going on in their lives. I mean, it's a relationship building process on my side. I don't think anybody really does that because there's no NGO program for that, right? There's no NGO or research program for just getting to know, meet, and understand and build relationships with gang members. But that was my MO. And that built at least enough understanding and trust to be able to start saying, okay, guys, well, what do you guys want out of this, and what do we need to do to make sure that people start with the argument that innocent people shouldn't be involved in this conflict, and everyone agrees on that, right? And from there, you can start building in more and more. This conflict needs to end, all the way through to, okay, we need to negotiate and mediate this conflict to a conclusion. There's different, what they call in other methodologies, like focused deterrence. They call them levers of influence that government has. In South Africa, those levers are pretty weak. In America, they might threaten prosecution, threaten to remove benefits very specifically to your friend, to your family, and to anyone involved in gangs. If you don't do these positive things, you need to start attending these meetings. You need to start going to different, development, personal development programs, and even community development programs. In South Africa, like, we just didn't have that kind of wraparound government. That it might exist in different pockets and in different ways, but there was no way to execute that kind of limitation or removal of rights and resources from people's families. And if you had, it would have been, a pretty difficult scenario in terms of determining who are the people you would be doing it to, because it's such it's a much larger organization with far fewer difficult to figure out decision making. And so for me, it was going in and actually hitting the ground and understanding the neighborhood and understanding the people and the gang members themselves. And I also benefited from being a strange figure. There aren't a lot of white American. There aren't any real American. I'm talking nationality Americans now.
Not gang member Americans. American Americans.
There aren't a lot of.
We had to explain that. At times we had to explain he's not from that Americans. He's from the real Americans.
Right.
And there was times the gangs were a little bit confused.
Absolutely. Because understandably, right? Because I'm sure there was a number of people that just referred to me as the American,
Yeah.
And so if you're just saying, oh, that American was here, people don't ask, oh, the American, the gang member. They just assume it's the gang member, right? But so in that regard, I had cover. I had like a protection that not everyone enjoys. But that's what got me to the place where we could start designing solutions. And I've been speaking mostly about our direct intervention work, meaning how did we outreach to understand, analyze, and then intervene in conflict. None of that includes, I suppose, yet any of the technology that went into that, right? So we were building other things that sort of were designed to try to have an effect on gangs, whether that was data visualization, we spent a long period responding to and analyzing some of the shot caller data, right? Shot spotter data. And then we were building and trying to understand what kind of a direct gang intervention program would look like, right? So we had a number of translating youth hubs into specifically a gang intervention space. But those are all, I think, projects onto their own right. When it comes to the direct gang intervention work, it was trying to build up networks of people that could perform intervention work, trying to help them analyze that, and doing a lot of that work on the ground, and all the way through to actually mediating conflicts within gangs. And that wasn't the idea of that. Wasn't that we were going to become the gang mediating team. the hope for that was that government would continue to fund things like ceasefire so that they could do it, and we could continue building and understanding what strategies would best work in South Africa. And we kept pitching at them a larger gang intervention process in which the different communities had their own ceasefires, and that we could kind of work to help train and monitor those ceasefires rather than it be us. But because government was moving so slow, we had to do it ourselves in some, well, we didn't have to. We felt an obligation to do it ourselves because of our connection to those communities and because they were suffering with serious violence and sometimes these gang outbursts. And we wouldn't be able to, you'd enter the community just to visit for your normal sort of meetings, and everyone would be terrified and refuse to move through the community. And you'd see this vast difference in times of gang conflict than in times of what we call peace, although that's an extreme term for it. And sometimes, literally in 5 minutes, if somebody from our group or the gangs or ourselves said there is a peace agreement, all of a sudden the streets are full with kids playing again, and that kind of a thing I think weighs on you, in an ethical way of like, what responsibility do I have, no matter what my mandate is, to try to do what we can do to resolve this if we have a position in the community. And so that's, I think, the way we saw it in that era was we cannot allow ourselves not to be involved, because we have a responsibility to try to create that safety. We're not providing it, but to create it or help create it for the community so that kids can live normal lives, so that people can go to school, and so that business can operate.
Yeah, something just came to mind as you were speaking, Nate, and also Douglas' question on, do you just go into the community? How do you do this? And I think the hardest part was to get the community leaders to come to a meeting to discuss the gang violence in the area. You could never get the relevant community leaders in a room. It was easier to get the gangs to come to a mediation. Not easy, but more. We got that right, but to get the community leaders into a room and to bring them to the understanding that they have a role to play was one of the hardest, and to get the pitch right for them to understand why it's important to engage with gangs. That I found as in Manenberg and in other areas very challenging to get them into that room. If you get 8 community leaders to a meeting to discuss the violence, it was a lot. And they will always find the excuse why they can't attend the meeting. I don't know if you can agree with that experiences in Manenberg. It was very challenging to get people to come together to discuss the safety or the gang violence in Manenberg. It was not easy, but it was more easier to get the gangs together, right? Even if it is one group, it was easy for us to walk. We knew where they are. You get a group of gangs, but to call them to a meeting where Rusanda and the other safety forum communities just don't pitch up, right?
I think that's true.
I think we identify the community as part of this problem, the community leaders.
Well, I think I would flip that on it, Colin. So the way that I saw it, and I think you're right. I mean, I think I don't know that I would say that they're part of the problem, although I think we have other reasons to say that. I think in this case, I'd say they, and I'm trying to grow more sympathy for this, right? I'm back in the States, and I'm working with some of these focused deterrence guys, and all of the agencies, they have enough on their plate as a mandate to deal with people that are not gang affiliated. Their big aim is to keep those they still see gang members the way that I think I used to see South Africa as perceiving them before I got so integrated. Or not into South Africa, integrated into the gang world. which is that the gang members are not worth saving, right? Like even governmental agencies will say, okay, like take the library for example, and we had a I want to shout out the Manenberg Library for a second because they let us run all types of intervention mediations from the library. And they let us do that sometimes when they were in the epicenter of violence, right? That library in Manenberg was situated in a high conflict zone at that time. What I would say is that what I learned from that is just how much. So I'd experienced it as a teacher and in other NGOs where communities would kind of shut down and we wouldn't see as many kids or something like that during conflict periods. But at this scale, it's much worse. Because the reality is stray bullets are flying all over the place. The amount of bullets that take aim in a gang conflict in Manenberg are very few. They're mostly flying for the sake of flying, right? There's a lot of trying to establish boundaries and trying to fire warning shots and people shooting at each other. The kids running out from behind a wall, shooting randomly in the direction of a gang, but that doesn't mean it's going to get there. And so what we found and what is self-evident when you think about it is that most of these people and most of these agencies just don't operate at that time. When that's happening, they're going to shut down. The adults don't want to risk their lives to run a daycare. And more than that, they don't really want to have kids moving from their houses to these daycares and youth programs or whatever it may be when there are bullets flying around. And so with that, I think in the South African case, it's a serious developmental problem. It's serious if you're a business and you can't operate for weeks out of the year, or can't build a building because of the construction mafia, or can't operate your youth program because there's too much conflict in the community.
People can't even attend hospitals. Hospitals have to close down. Ambulance services don't have access to come into the community.
If you're a nurse in a hospital, you think of yourself as a triage to some degree for gang violence, and even that makes you tired and sick, I think, right? There's a lot of as a triage, as somebody who tries to repair or try to prevent loss of life, right? You don't think of yourself as having to live with and deal with gang members directly automatically. You might encounter that, and like doctors, in the States are kind of have this famous refrain around it, right? Of just like, they're gonna come back in a day or two, so why take it too seriously, right? It's like there's this gang members that come in that are shot are treated as second class for various obvious reasons, right? And so if you're operating in a space that has that turns into a full conflict zone, oftentimes you just wake up and your anxiety is great for that. It's just that there's too much risk to you in your life to go into work that day, and that made it hard, I think, and that makes it hard for all of development in gang violence. Communities that suffer with gang violence have a drastic reduction in the amount of development they can do, because you can't have consistent school all year, because you don't have the other programs operating as frequently or as reliably as other areas, and because there are times where you just can't even leave your house to go to the shop. And so that is, I think, how I viewed that at the time, and why I think we started sort of saying, okay, gang violence isn't just a problem of violence; it's a problem of development. It's a problem preventing wholesale community development from happening. And why, I suppose, in my case, I moved from education work to violence work, because I think it's the most important, or not most important, but certainly the least dealt with issue that prevents communities, especially underprivileged ones and low-income communities, from developing, is violence, and gang violence in particular. It keeps people out, keeps businesses from working within, keeps the Cape Flats distant from Cape Town, and keeps people, in this case, in Cape Town's case, Black and colored communities, from being able to develop and grow. So that's and sorry that I went on a bigger sort of social tangent there. That's just what you made me think of when you're talking about how hard it is to get those NGO partners to the table. It is easier to get gang members to the table, in part, I think, because we had a direct message for them, and in part because it is their issue. Where for the schools, it is not their issue, right? For any other NGO, generally speaking, gang violence is not their primary issue. And that's why at the time, and I'm neglected to mention this, I spent a lot of time just trying to explain to NGOs. I built like a number of presentations around helping NGOs understand how they can cope with and have a positive effect on gangs, even if their mandate lies outside of it. So if they want to, if they want to be having a positive effect on the youth, if they're passionate about or care about the gang violence that happens in their community, how can they tailor their programs slightly differently, and very slightly, to have an impact on that. That's something we can go into another day, maybe, because it goes into sort of social analysis and other things. But that's I think why we see that, and why we were able to have such a positive relationship with the gangs, is because no one else wanted to talk to them. And yeah, sorry, Colin, I want to see what your thoughts are on that, because you raised that, you brought up that no one would talk to them, and that's left this impact on them. And I think that's an important point as to why they respond the way they do sometimes.
Yeah,
You hear me, buddy?
no, I agree mostly what you have said, Nate. And my thoughts is at that moment the community, especially with the safety forum, all right, where I think I'm not sure did we support them or did we initiate it to call meetings, community engaged meetings in Manenberg, when community got caught in the crossfire, especially where the bullets were flying and children were hit or people on their way from work, all right? And I
Yeah,
think, yeah, we had to, the community couldn't walk in the streets. And at that time, the safety forum, the Rusanda and those guys, they were like the voice of safety. And
sort
so
of. Yeah,
they speak on behalf of the community, but they couldn't get the community that they say they represent to come to a community meeting where we wanted to discuss the safety and of community and the violence, because at that moment the point that I tried to raise was the community were caught in the crossfire. All right, they
yeah,
couldn't move, they couldn't go to clinics in the community, they couldn't get the services. But then we found that the community leaders, they couldn't get the community.
yeah. That's like
And I
a
want to
bigger.
speak
That's
on
a bigger
the
one. That's,
I don't know if the community see them at that point as part of a problem, not the gang problem, but a problem in Manenberg, because we know that they were the gatekeepers. If they
yeah,
couldn't be the implementation agency in that area, which they didn't even have the expertise or the training, all right, to
right.
intervene or the credibility, then they will keep anyone out of that space.
I think that, yeah. Sorry, I was trying to allude to that. I mean, there's a lot of reasons in which we might see some of the community members and leaders find themselves, either are intentionally, or find themselves becoming gatekeepers and otherwise slowing up the process, right? And I think you're right. But I think the group that we had that was committed, at least to themselves, to attending the safety forums, for example, weren't always, they didn't necessarily have a large community representation pool. They were more what you might call like a champion for safety rather than a community leader. But we don't, these titles are loose, so people call themselves what they want, right? They'll say I'm a leader of this, or I represent that. But largely speaking, They were mostly group of people with different interests that just cared enough about gang violence to attend these meetings every week, but they didn't seem to have a whole lot of political power at the time. So you had to work through a whole lot of additional people in that regard, and that was kind of how we at different times other more representative community leaders would come and go, but they weren't able to commit themselves just to that process all the time, if that makes sense to everyone. So like the issue we would face is we'd get either promises or guarantees that things could happen from community members and leaders, but we would see very little action at times. And most of that is that in times of violence, people largely don't respond to a lot of that sort of community development interest. They're kind of they're not they're not geared toward that, and they see this as a moment to sit back and stay away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. I smile now. I don't know if I'm getting offline on the topic, but and when they came together, like the Errol, if Errol appear and then there's a fight in the community, the people that have to resolve the conflict, they start fighting in the meeting with one
Yeah,
another. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I guess we should also acknowledge that a lot of fighting does happen amongst community leaders. The politics of community leadership, or just community agencies in general, is as heated as any parliamentary floor. There's a
yeah,
lot of battling and political. They see each other as threats to whether or not they can continue doing the work they care about, and they see
yeah,
each other as having taken away an opportunity from one another often. And so when you get them in the room, a lot of the conflict is between them. And I think you're getting at this point where there was a gang conflict we were mediating, in which we were going from gang to gang, and a number of gang members just said, "Hey, we need you guys to mediate the community agencies. We don't like
yes,
their battles are becoming our battles,
yeah.
and it's not, and it's one, we're not interested, and two, we're annoyed."
Yes. Yeah, 100%. That's why I said they were part of a problem, not the problem. If,
Yeah.
if I can rephrase my words.
No, absolutely no, and those were bizarre moments, right? I mean, I remember just kind of
Yeah.
that moment.
Yeah.
That
But in
moment.
defense of them, in defense, or as you have advocated for our communities, I appreciate it. I think it was the trauma was very high that they even experienced, because it was a time of high violence when we enter Manenberg, where bullets were flying, and I think it was trauma that have influence in their behavior. And
Yeah,
I think we connected even some of them through with agencies that could have been a help or support for them on
yeah.
the in the trauma that they have, the ongoing trauma they have experienced.
Yeah, I mean I think that's the goal you kind of have to take is, understanding, especially in violent communities like that, where like everyone involved has a violent story.
Yes.
And a lot of your meeting time ends up being taken up with hearing that story, sometimes
Yeah.
repeatedly.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember nights when we have to sit, we have to go to the gangs, but we have to sit in Errol's front room because he's so traumatized. He don't want
mhm,
to move out, and we want to go on the streets. And we had to understand why he acting that way, because that was the place he feels safe
mhm.
in, and all the trauma that was happening, and it was, I mean, it was very. At times I didn't want it to go, you know. But
Yeah,
at least after he had vent his anger, we got him to move and to try and, get the word out there and go do the engagement.
yeah, yeah. And that's part of it. Like when you're dealing with that community is like, more than 50% of your time is kind of going and is trying to is working with and through people's histories of this issue, you know, whether that's direct trauma or storytelling or uh, you know, anxiety and responses to that. And so you, even with the people that say that they're, you know, comfortable with this and that they deal with gangs and that they try to do intervention, are still going to have regular moments where they're just, the reason they're doing that is because they experienced it at some point in some way, right? They lost a child. They remember
Mm.
incidences in their own childhood that were traumatizing to them, or any number of incidents they've seen since. And you don't know, and they don't know oftentimes what's popping up uh, in any given scenario. What this particular gang conflict is helping to bring to the surface, um,
Mm.
and they kind of panic.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's a human and reasonable response. And you don't, but you, it's just tough when you're trying to build a, you know, when you're working as a collective and you don't know who's going through that when they're going through it. They may not know. They think they're fighting for something. They think they're
Yeah.
fighting
I'm going to
for,
finish us off here, or wrap us up because we're running out of time. But just to
yeah.
finish us off, quick question for Colin: what is the current status of the gang conflict in in the Cape Flats, Cape Town generally, and Manenberg in particular these days today?
Yeah, it grew worse. It's worse. It's worse, and gangs is getting ruthless. There's no respect. In the past, there was respect on the streets. That was the main thing, but there's no respect. All right, so it grew worse, and you could have when we were on the streets, we could have kind of. I don't want to use a famous word of someone, um, but we could have managed the violence. But there's no one that wants to go out there and speak directly to gangs. They would speak through the media, but there's no one that will go directly. So now it's out of control.
So it's
All right.
much
We-
worse. Yeah.
Yeah, we if we couldn't find a leader in the past, we will go directly to the shooter or to the shot caller. All right. So we could have managed it. We weren't obligated really to rely on a leader that is nowhere. But currently, there's no one that wants to just go and intervene. Remember, Noah said an intervention doesn't mean you solve the thing. An intervention is when you go
Hmm.
right to the person and start talking, initiate the talk. That is what I know, I see and know out of experience is an intervention. To go to that to where the hard living strommel to the sevens is for that half hour when you intervene, you keep them and preventing them of shooting someone. There's no people like that, and there's no real leadership. Right? We actually have connected the leadership back to the streets that they supply with drugs and guns, right? To come and have a say in what is happening because they try to disconnect them from everything that was happening. But without our presence, we connected them again to something that they are connected, but that wanted to keep. Today, there's
And
just
that was effective in reducing
no.
violence.
Say again?
And that was effective in reducing violence, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, currently, there's no one, right? And it's just
Yeah.
getting out of control. Government have abandoned the communities. There's no, that's not rocket science. The community is left on their own. We even don't have decent patrol vans, SEPS patrol vans. The other night I asked, what is this? A patrol van, it looks more than a bucket that collects scrap. So if you don't have a decent patrol van in a high-risk area, it can't get better. It's going to get worse. And with the lack of funding in Cape Town, no one is interested. So the community is being left on their own.
Cool. And on that not so optimistic note, hopefully things will get better in the future. I'm gonna end this,
We all hold our thumbs.
recording.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.